The next unit we are going to be covering in forensics is documentation analysis. So when we are looking at documents that have been submitted, whether it may be a last will and testament, maybe it is a final letter, like a suicide note, maybe it is a piece of money or checks that have been written, we want to make sure that we can actually authenticate it. When we have a document that is in question, we're going to look at some of the handwriting, the ink that was used, the paper type, in order to assess its validity. Things we might analyze, again, contracts, passports, wills, checks, licenses, all of those would be things that somebody may want to forge. So in order to authenticate that, we can look at the specific types of papers, pigments, and inks in order to test to see if they match up to exemplars. And exemplars are documents that we know are actually true and valid. All right, so some of the different fields that this could relate back to is historical dating, trying to identify the age of old documents, which could play impact in our history books, etc. In a fraud investigation, so trying to identify where the money went, whether this is real money or fake money. We have paper and ink specialists that actually are able to identify specific types of paper. They can also look at the different types of ink used in various pens and identify the specific type of pen that was used. Now, just because we identify that it was a ballpoint pen that was made by Bic does not necessarily mean that every single person that has a Bic pen could be the actual suspect in question. But it does allow for us to develop and identify more class evidence that can be used in our case, again, as long as it has that probative value. Forgery specialists look at how an individual would actually alter, obliterate, change, or doctor different documents, legal papers, photos, things like that, in order to either make money or possibly make a homicide look like a suicide. Typewriting, this is actually looking at trying to identify the specific typewriter typed, so either on an actual legitimate typewriter or on a computer. Look at the origin, the make, and the models. And then again, any type of cybercrime would fall into the computer crime investigators. So anytime that you transfer money electronically, maybe you're running a scam over the internet, they would be the ones that would come in with that. All right, so when we are looking at documents, we want to compare it with our exemplars. And remember, I mentioned this earlier, exemplars are known documents that we know was authored by the specific person. So for example, I could go to all the different documents you guys submit on Home Access and through Canvas, and I actually have your handwriting samples. Now, if a note shows up and you are giving me this note from your parents, and ironically, your parents' note looks exactly like your handwriting, I would probably say that those two match, and that's probably not a note from your parents. All right, so when we look at handwriting and analysis of it, we have to include two different phases. The first phase is analyzing the ink that was used, the paper, whether it was pen or pencil. Was it a typewriter or was it a printer? Or did they even possibly make copies of the materials? Then we actually look at the visual examination of the writing itself, and that is what you guys are going to be doing today with our 12 basic characteristics of handwriting. So when we look at the knowns, so we look at those exemplars, we look at what characteristics actually stick out. And then we go to the question document and we see if any of those characteristics match. If I only have one document that I was known to be written by Miss Baker, and I get another paper that is supposedly written by Miss Baker, if I only have two documents, how do I know which one was actually written by Miss Baker? So I have to make sure that I have enough exemplars. So maybe you'll go to my house and collect some of the checks that I've written. Maybe you'll go to my house, collect my diary or any papers that I've written, notes I've sent, cards that I've sent, and try to see if you can identify some of those characteristics with my handwriting that does or does not show up on the question document. So when you are going to obtain a handwriting sample, so say a note was left and you suspect that it was written by the suspect, if we have a known suspect, we can collect a handwriting sample. But in order to do that, I never want to show him the actual note in question, or I guess her, right? I don't want to show them the question document, because then they know that the writing that they submit to the police has to be different. All right, something else to note is when you are collecting a sample from somebody, you want to make sure that you do not tell them how to spell anything or use any abbreviations, because those might be some unique characteristics that you're trying to see if they actually populate back out on the sample. So for example, if I had to write Miss Baker does her homework, if you're talking to Miss Baker as a 6th grader back in like 2004, she would have written Miss Baker does her homework. So a couple things to point out. Number one, I would have spelled does wrong. I also would have abbreviated homework with HW. So if I then go back to the question document and I find that does was spelled wrong and maybe they used an abbreviation, then I would know that, hey, this is how Miss Baker writes out those words, and that might indicate that they could have been the person that wrote the note in question. I want to make sure I use materials similar to those of the original document. So if it was originally written in pencil, I do not want to write it in ink. If it was on a lined piece of paper versus on a blank computer piece of paper, I want to make sure I'm using, again, the same type of paper. I want to ask them to write certain words. Those certain words might be like does, because I know it's going to be spelled wrong. Maybe it's homework, because I'm going to abbreviate it as HW. So those specific words will allow for me to write it. So if in the note it says, I killed her, maybe you would actually have them write, maybe instead have them write, her dog was killed by a fox. Okay, you're still going to get some of those similar words that you're looking for, that killed, her, are still going to populate up, but you're also not reading them the exact note word for word. So we want to make sure that it is still matching some of the different parts of the document, so then we can go back to those specific words and say, hey, they do match or they don't match. I also want to make sure that I have them sign the text. So after they write it, they're going to sign. And then make sure you always, always, always have a witness when you are collecting a handwriting sample, because you could easily come back and say, well, I didn't write that, or that isn't written by me, or I don't know where they got that letter, that's not mine. All right, so there's a couple different ways that you can forge something. You guys probably, when you were younger, did trace forgeries. So think about it. You find a picture and you want to copy it, so you're going to put one piece of paper over the other, and you're going to hold it up to the window so you can actually trace it. So when I look at a trace forgery, I'm going to be able to trace a genuine signature. So think about Kobe Bryant. Okay, Kobe passed away last spring. Kobe's signature has gone up a lot. So a lot of people want to have items with his signature on it. So we know that his signature does exist and it is authenticated. But if I have a pretty good example and I can actually trace it, then that would be considered a trace forgery. But if I decide, hey, blind forgery, I think I know how to write Kobe Bryant. K-O-B-E. Maybe that's how he signs his name. Boom. That's a blind forgery. I have no clue what his signature actually looks like, but I'm just going to go ahead and forge it. Okay. If it's a simulated forgery, that's you've seen your parents' signature before. I can probably copy my mom's name because I know certain characteristics, like her A is pretty curly right there, and then her Baker, the B extends down. Okay, so you can make it look pretty similar. Okay, so with that simulated forgery, that is one that we can copy a genuine signature. I've seen it before. I'm not necessarily tracing it, but I can look at it and try to copy it. Trace, again, putting one piece of paper over the other, copying it from a genuine signature. Blind forgery, again, just trying to make it up, right? Even though you've never seen the actual signature before. All right, so if you take a look at these two, these are really, really close, all right? Don't you agree? There are a couple things that are slightly different though. So when we look at those forged examples and we say, okay, height of the letters, look how this is taller here than at the second point. But on Q, it's the opposite way. So when I'm looking at those, the angle of the letters as well, this one's more slanted here, that one's more vertical. You have some unique letters as well. For example, this F at the beginning, it's a little bit different. The connection to the U has a different shape. We have a period there at the end. You can also see the ends for the Helen are a little bit different as well. All the letters, though, are connected in a similar fashion. They did a pretty good job there. They include the line below. That line, same angle, again, very similar. One other thing that I want to point out, look at the Y and look at the Y here. Do you see how that one has more of a hesitation? And so it comes down, and then rather than keep looping around, it makes that little bump right there. Okay, that is not found up in this one above. So we know that this one is a pretty good forgery. Probably looking at it, you probably would have thought, hey, it passes. But there are just slightly some differences. Again, those angles of the letters there versus there are a little bit different. All right, so different documents that individuals may forge. Obviously, check forgery is a big one. Checks that you get in the mail, like your IRS tax returns, your state tax returns, you want to make sure you don't get that as a check, because people will go fishing through your mailbox to collect them. And then what they'll do is they'll remove your name, put their name, and then now you have an actual check that is written, that is a real check coming out from the federal government that now is going into a different person's bank account. Money, you guys know money is counterfeited all the time. That's why when you go to the store, they use those markers to see if it is real. Your $20 or above usually is what they check. Somebody could forge your identity and steal your identity, like your social security number, your driver's license. So you want to make sure you are never sharing that information with anybody, except maybe your employer, or when you're applying to college, you also list out your social security number. Credit cards get stolen all the time. They just need to steal the number, and you can use that credit card online. You don't have to actually have the physical card in person. So that's something that is easily stolen. But I will say that even with credit cards, if your credit card gets stolen and say they rack up a bunch of charges, you do have a lot of protections from the bank so that you wouldn't actually have to pay for those charges, which is kind of cool. All right, art. If you guys have ever seen the show White Collar, we can actually steal art and try to forge art and then sell it for lots and lots of money. Contracts as well, that's usually when it starts to come into play with homicides, changing people's death wishes, what they're going to do with all their final estates, things like that would be something that could get forged. All right, so with that counterfeit money, there's different ways that we actually protect your money, and that's by adding in a lot of those different colors, the different fibers. They add those very detailed portraits. They add those little tiny security threads, those red threads in your money. So if you hold it up to a light, you can see those. The ink that they are using as well is different, so you can see it shift from blue to black depending upon the angle of which you hold that money up to the light. So what they're trying to do is really make it hard for people to counterfeit money. So they also include serial numbers, watermarks, the type of paper that is used, the paper color. All are in an attempt to prevent people from counterfeiting the US dollar. All right, so when we look at those documents, again, you know how I talked about having a check that is written out to Miss Baker? Well, what they can actually do is use chemicals to actually erase that name and then put in their own name, okay? So you can actually remove that name with different means, either with UV light or IR light, or you can also use those chemicals. Now, when something was originally written with Miss Baker, you're going to notice that those indentations are going to be on the paper. So even if they remove Miss Baker, those impressions are still going to be on that check. So we can actually use different techniques in order to visualize those indentations. And you guys actually have a forensics file that you are watching at the end of this week that is actually pretty cool, because that is how they caught this individual, is by indentations that were left on the paper. All right, so a linguist is somebody that looks at the words, how they were written. I can guarantee you that my mom, who is, let's see, she's turning 60 this year, is not going to write a note that says dude or brah or TBH, or to be honest, right? Now, I will say some of my students will send me notes, and in those notes, it'll say LOL or JK. My mom is not going to use that. My students, though, who are about 14 to 16 years old, are going to use that. So that can indicate either their age, their gender, their ethnicity, the level of education, their training, and possible ideologies. All right, so when we are continuing to analyze that handwriting sample, one thing that we can actually do is take a piece of the actual note that has ink on it and run what is called paper chromatography. So both of these, if you look at these two samples, are from different black pens. But the different pens, each company uses a different combination or a different mixture of inks in order to generate the black color. So when we use a solvent and we put this substance, this little piece of paper, with our note that maybe said one or kill, okay? As you run that paper chromatography, we put this in a solvent. That solvent moves up through the actual ink, and then it's going to spread up, all the way to the top. And that ink is going to separate out into different characteristics. Those inks, if you look from the left and the right, do not actually match. So on the left, it's separated out into purples and yellows, and on the right, we have red, yellow, and blue. So we can actually calculate what is called an RF value for that ink. The RF value stands for your retention factor. This is just a number that's going to be associated with a particular ink, and it expresses how far the actual ink travels up the paper. All right, when we look at paper, so again, we not only are analyzing the handwriting, but we're going to analyze the piece of paper, the type of ink that was used. So looking at the paper, we can look at the type of material, how thick it is, what the weight of the individual sheet of paper is, how dense it is, the color, are there any watermarks, what is its actual age. Now, I will say you can age paper by using heat. So if you use an oven, you can actually age that paper, and that will throw it off. We also look if that paper fluoresces light or not. Pencils, again, different pencils have different hardnesses. You know, I don't know if you guys remember this, if you think back to when you used mechanical pencils, you guys had 0.5 lead, you had 0.7 lead, you had a number 2 pencil, some were not number 2 pencils. And so when we look at pencils, the lead component is a little bit different. So each pencil, if you are a person who enjoys art and likes to draw, you know that we have different values. We have 3B, 2B, B, HB, F, H, 2H, 3H, and 4H, and that indicates whether the lead is a little bit softer or harder. And then it would indicate also the thickness of the lines. So some of those lines will appear thicker, and some will get thinner and thinner and thinner. Okay? Again, remember the type of pen, the paper are all different types of class evidence, but the individual handwriting does allow us to individualize that to a specific person. Any trash marks from copiers or serial numbers for printers that we can identify would also be classified as individual evidence. So today what you guys are going to be doing is taking a look at the 12 basic characteristics for comparing handwriting. So I'm going to jump to the next page. So this is all your notes. You want to keep this page. This page is super, super important. Gives you a little bit more information about line quality, spacing of words, letters, all that good stuff. So when we look at that line quality, we're trying to answer whether or not the letters flow together or they are very intentional strokes. So looking at that line quality again, we can see, is it a very smooth connection or is it shaky? Is it very juvenile or deliberate? Remember, we all learned how to write with those lines that had the dots in the middle. We had to make those perfect B. We had to make the perfect lowercase a with a K that comes up to that middle line, and then an E and an R, right? So that is very, very deliberate or very juvenile. In terms of the spacing of the words and letters, what is the average space between? Okay. We can compare there. Do we have a lot of space, not a lot of space? Do you write on top of each other or not? Is our left margin jagged or is it completely straight? So here, if you look, the words do not follow a nice perfect straight line. On this one, we have an angled to the margin. We can look at the angle on the right margin. We can look at the space between our capital letters and our smaller letters here. We can look about between words as well. Our 12 characteristics. Other things to compare is our size and proportion. So looking at the height of the overall writing, is it very, very tall or is it short? How do you compare big letters versus small letters? So for example, when I write my name, Colleen, my L's and my E's are all about the same height. Now realistically, it should be like this, big L's, 2 lowercase e's. The heights are a little bit different, whereas here they're about the same. We can look at different types of strokes. How does it actually change? Do we have a very diminished stroke or do we increase the size of our stroke as we get writing? How many times do you lift up your pen? Are you lifting it up or are all the letters connected? We also can look at the slants. We can look at some of our habits. Do we have any unique characteristics with how we start certain letters versus others? So for today, what you're going to be doing is consider. And again, here's a few more for you. That pen pressure, are you pressing hard, not? What's the angle of what you're written? Do you actually connect right down at the base of the line, or do you go over the line? Do you slant up the line? Do you come through the line? We don't really write on lined paper anymore, so you guys probably don't see that change very often. And then again, those unique strokes characteristics, okay? How they dot their I's, cross their T's, all of that is important as well. So for today, I want you guys to take a look at our Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch the pail of water. I want you to consider those 12 characteristics. What is the line spacing? What is the margins? Is it slanted? What angle is it written? How hard was it pressed? Is there any fancy habits like those little fancy H's here? So I want you to go through and take a look at those questions and try to identify some of the unique characteristics for this writing. Make sure to submit that worksheet once you are done. Thanks, guys.